We'll finish with Laam, who's Associate Professor at York University in my Department of Political Science, whose most recent book is The Contribution of the Gentrification of Nightlife and Rights to the City. Also a well-known writer on Seoul and Seoul politics, and she'll partly be doing a comparison of issues related to Seoul and the Greenbelt.
Thank you. So today I'm going to present about the struggles over green city activism and neoliberal urbanization with the case of Greenbelt deregulation in Korea, especially around the Seoul metropolitan region. My presentation may sound too specific and particular compared to those two folks who presented right before me. I thought our presentation was going to be more international in our scope, and I thought we are going to look into different cities. So anyway, this is another way of saying that I prepared my presentation with many details about what happened about Greenbelt deregulation in Seoul. Hopefully my presentation makes some contributions to our discussion today, and I believe that there are many points that connects my case with the framework that Stefan and also Kanishika provided before me. So Greenbelt was deregulated in Korea in the midst of struggles over democratization and neoliberalization in the 1990s. Since the deregulation, the subsequent two political regimes built affordable housing in deregulated greenbelts in the Seoul metropolitan region. I want to talk about the controversies and struggles that unfolded throughout these processes and the implications of these struggles to the urban activist politics in a neoliberalizing city over developmentalist country like Korea. As I pointed out later, the broad urban progressive bloc in Seoul metropolitan region was forced to weigh the value of green space against that of the affordable housing. While urban progressives were being divided over this dilemma of choosing between the green and the affordable housing, the state was able to proceed with housing developments within greenbelts that had long been off-limit to these types of development. Furthermore, more legal and institutional arrangements favorable for private development and private appropriation of development gains in greenbelts have also been made. Greenbelt deregulations were, in a sense, what David Harvey called the spatial fix, or neoliberal spatial fix in this case, that enabled the development capital in Korea to find new sites for its renewed expansion. It is clear that this process would have grave social as well as environmental repercussions in the region. While the recent neoliberal regimes, both in the global north and global south, have seen the growing importance of the construction and real estate economy, South Korean political economy has been heavily dependent upon the construction sector from the 1960s. The construction sector occupied the critical place in the government's economic and spatial modernization projects at the time. In this process, development-related public corporations and the Ministry of Construction became the commanding height of the nation's construction projects, and their power grew exceedingly powerful. Also, the so-called construction complex was consolidated, through which the triangle of bureaucrats, politicians, and private companies had a strong control over the construction sector. And this is why some people called South Korea as the construction state, like Japan. The construction complex, for sure, has undergone changes over the years since then. From the 1990s, with democratization processes in Korea, new social and economic formations, such as environmental and other dissident groups, have entered political arenas, increasingly challenging the machine of the construction state. However, Despite these changes, many of the core traits of the construction state have remained intact. The central government still exercises a significant power. Planning and development processes are still very anti-democratic, and pernicious impacts of these constructions were mostly borne by economically disenfranchised working class households and the natural environment. And since the late 1990s, the machine has been also neoliberalizing, working more in favor of private interests, and the private sector's participation in development has increased. One ideology that has been promulgated by the construction complex is that the sharply rising property prices, especially in the Seoul metropolitan region, can be tackled by supplying more housing stocks into the system. The housing provision ratio in Korea grew over 100% in the early 2000s, but the owner occupancy rate reached only approximately 60%. That is, the housing problem in Korea has clearly been the problem of unequal ownership structure, but the supply centricism, i.e. that more supplies would cure those housing problems, still dominate the policy directives. This has been the case with the regimes across different political spectrum. And this type of supply centricism has been deeply formative in the ways that Greenbelts were deregulated and housing projects were planned and proceeded in the Seoul metropolitan region. The Greenbelt was first implemented by the military President Park Chung-hee regime in early 1970s in Korea. The major purpose of the Greenbelts at the time was for the national security and also for the control of the urban sprawl for major cities. Since then, only minimal releases of development control were allowed in Greenbelts. And it was not until the 1990s democratization period that the Greenbelt landlords organized among themselves to demand the abolition of Greenbelts to reclaim their property rights. And a lot of those landowners also included speculators who had been buying lands in Greenbelt in the previous decades. In alliance with those landowners, some planning experts also argued for the abolition of Greenbelt regulations. They contended that Greenbelts had hardly performed environmental functions because of the illegal developments that occurred there in the previous decades. Instead, they argued Greenbelts had reduced aware of lands, especially in Seoul metropolitan region, spawned leapfrogging developments there, and also led to the high-density development and land housing price hike in Seoul. In response, President Kim Dae-jung, who was the first civilian president elected in 1998, commenced Greenbelt deregulations. Greenbelt deregulation was also part and parcel of the broader deregulatory moves carried out after the IMF bailout of the country in the late 1990s. The Greenbelt deregulation initiative triggered protests from environmental and other urban activist groups. These activist groups contended that Greenbelts are ecologically important and need protection, and that the deregulation of Greenbelt would reduce green space and also intensify urban sprawls, especially in Seoul capital region. They mobilized different social justice activist formations existing in Korea at that time and established pro-Greenbelt coalition. And by 2000, about 240 activist groups participated in this pro-Greenbelt coalition. Through many protests and campaigning activities, the coalition turned a good number of media outlets into the side of pro-Greenbelt. However, the organizational capacity of this coalition was not high enough to stop the current of Greenbelt deregulation. the coalition was invited to participate in the Greenbelt Revision Committee that the central government established, but it was only 2 members from this coalition that were allowed in the committee among the total of 23 committee members. There was definitely the power imbalance issue in the committee. In the end, Greenbelt deregulation was announced in 1999. The new law mandated that greenbelts were deregulated according to the environmental assessments of these lands under the leadership of the Ministry of Construction. Notes how the Ministry of Construction took an initiative on the greenbelt issue rather than the Ministry of Environment. The environmental impact study was conducted by the government, according to which the greenbelt lands with lower ecological value were mandated to be freed from the greenbelt category, and the lands with higher ecological values preserved. The total of 112 square kilometer of Seoul region's greenbelt was proposed for deregulation. It was also mandated that the deregulation should be carried out following regional development guidelines specified in the 15-year metropolitan plan rather than all at once. This was only one demand that the Ministry of Construction accepted and incorporated in the revised Greenbelt laws among many demands made by the pro-Greenbelt coalition. The Greenbelt coalition was disorganized shortly after the new Greenbelt law was passed, and different environmental and social justice groups scaled down their activism to fight at the scale of local. The next one. Yeah. The following center-left Nomuhyun regime built social housing complexes named Bungmin rental housing in the Seoul metropolitan region from 2003 to 2007. The designation of the districts for Bungmin rental housing was solely done by the central government without any adequate time allowed for consultations with activists or local residents. It was also the case that the central government designated Bungmin housing complexes even before the regional plan for Seoul metropolitan region was crafted, which was the violation of the clause in the new Greenbelt law that the pro-Greenbelt coalition pushed forward before, as I just mentioned. There emerged protests from residents in alliance with environmental activists in some districts that were designated as the Bungmin housing complex, but they were not able to stop the process of the Bungmin housing construction, except in places where the Ministry of Environment also objected to the construction of the complexes. By the way, quite a few activist urban scholars entered the cabinet of Nomuhyun regime, which led some commentators to believe that the urban governing body in this regime was progressive. These urban activist scholars now in the government's cabinet argued that the Bungmin rental housing construction was a necessary measure to tackle the acute shortage of affordable housing for low-income class households in Seoul, even if it will destroy the greenbelts and also will intensify the problem of urban sprawl. Under this type of third-way urbanism, the progressive activist bloc was forced to choose between greenbelt on the one hand and affordable housing on the other. And this way, the oppositions to Bungmin housing complexes were divided, and the critics of it drastically tamed, which deterred effective political responses to the housing projects. This kind of third-way urbanism in Nomuhyun region, however, provided a fertile ground for an even more problematic greenbelt developments in the following right-wing neoliberal Lee regime. The Lee regime certainly capitalized on the precedent set by the previous Nomuhyun regime that the state would be given a green light for developments in greenbelts even if it did not go through proper consultation processes with activists and also local residents, as long as the development provides affordable housing. The Imeonbak regime pushed forward the 보금자리 housing program from 2008 to 2012 in deregulated greenbelts closer to Seoul than the previous 국민 rental housing. The regime criticized the 국민 rental housing for locating low-income households in isolated areas, segregated, far from Seoul, and proposed 보금자리 as a social mixing housing project where both social and market housing would be provided. It was, however, definitely the project that provided more market housing than social housing, provided not only by the public sector but also by the private sector too. The government announced that 78 square kilometer more greenbelt lands would be freed to build 보금자리 in the Seoul metropolitan region, in addition to the original 112 square kilometer designated in 1999. The greenbelts that had low ecological values had already been developed in the previous no regime, so the additional 78 square kilometer had to be found among those that had higher ecological value. For this, the government lowered ecological grades of some areas, especially those areas that greenhouses or hoop house, someone calls it hoop houses, were concentrated. Can you? So yeah, greenhouses. In Korea we call it for some reason vinyl houses, but hoop house or greenhouses. And the government put forward these greenhouses area as 보금자리 sites again without any grassroots consultation. Critics took issues with this move. They argued that greenbelts where these greenhouses concentrated did not lose their green functions or their role as the deterrent of conurbanization. These controversies were most severe in 보금자리 districts in Gangnam area, the most profitable prime real estate location in Seoul. Gangnam districts were all either in the first or second phase of the 보금자리 project. Critics suspected that the 보금자리 construction in these areas was related to the fact that it was one of the few last remaining undeveloped lands in Gangnam. The key selling point of 보금자리 was that units would be provided up to 50 to 80% cheaper than the going rate of the complex's neighboring areas. However, the government campaign of 보금자리 as an affordable housing program was clearly mystifying. In Gangnam's case, Gangnam is always very expensive, the housing there is always very expensive, so even if it is 50 to 80% cheaper, it's still very unaffordable to average working class household. So it was definitely unpropertied middle class households with disposable incomes with some savings who could afford a unit there in Gangnam. And these middle class contingents would profit from this resale of 보금자리 unit when the restriction periods for the resale of the units are over, because they bought this unit 50% cheaper than the going rate in the neighborhood. This would mean the private appropriation of the development gains of public goods such as Greenbelt by the relatively affluent class and the resultant consolidation of the existing inequality. From 2011 onwards, it became clear that the public agency had little capacity to take up the entire 보금자리 project due to its budgetary shortfall, and the government increased the proportion of the private sector's involvement in the 보금자리 construction and the ratio of private market housing. This was an interesting move, but was already very much predicted by market analysts as well as anti-보금자리 activists in 2008 when 보금자리 was initiated. Most recently, most of the 보금자리 projects in the third to fifth phases were cancelled, and the government decided to liberalize the land and property market in these districts. The private capital now has more available lands, for its expansion in the Seoul metropolitan region, where the land shortage has posed a barrier to the expansion of the development capital. All throughout this process, the local chapters of environmental organizations utilized the political spaces that were opened when the 보금자리 projects were unfolding, producing manifold contradictions. Activists strategically worked with local governments and also mobilized local residents that were against the 보금자리 project. However, again, their capacity was limited. The opposition environmental and urban activist groups were largely not equipped with sufficient human and political resources, and as the Imeongbak region launched numerous other construction projects destroying the natural environment across different parts of the country, the resources of the activists had to be distributed to different areas to wage multi-front wars against the region. In conclusion, Greenbelt deregulations and subsequent housing construction have become the mechanism where the problem of housing crisis is passed on to the green through the same measure of the construction state that created these housing problems in the first place. During the whole process of Greenbelt deregulation and development, greenbelts were treated as a reserve or backup spaces for future urban developments, and the ecological value of the greenbelt left peripheral. The case of Greenbelt poses a question about how to fight this neoliberal or neo-developmentalist offensive in Korea's case that is becoming more powerfully anti-green as well as pro-capital. The left will have to ponder on this question to establish a more radical urban political sphere away from the allure of the third-way urbanism that the Nomuyan regime developed. Thank you.